The material for this lecture comes from chapter 22 in Poimen, so make sure that you read the material carefully in this chapter. Today we are looking at compatibilism. So this is bouncing off the last couple chapters where we talked about libertarian free will, and then we also talked about determinism. Well, compatibilism is the attempt to reconcile free will with determinism. And one of the reasons why it tries to do this is because when we think about both of these issues just experientially, it seems like causal determinism offers an account for all events in the world. And we can think of this simply in terms of science. So when we do neurobiology, we're not assuming any type of free will in the brain. We're assuming some sort of causal determinism so that we can understand the workings of the chemical processes in the brain. On the other hand, it seems like I have real free choices and that I have the ability to act otherwise. So I can act one way or I can act the other way. So it seems like I have some sort of free will. And also, moral responsibility seems to presuppose free will. Because, of course, if all of my acts are determined, then how is it that I could be held accountable for any of my actions? And so, compatibilism seeks to ask this question: can determinism and free will be compatible? Is there any way that we can bring the two together? And so what a compatibilist will argue is that our actions are in fact determined. That is true. But we still do have real moral responsibility. So we can begin by looking at two different ways that we can think about free will and determinism. We can think about it in terms of internalism, and we can think about it in terms of externalism. So according to internalism, this is where we consider our behavior from a subjective perspective or from an experiential perspective. So when we say that it feels like I have free will, we're thinking in terms of just our experiences. We're thinking as an internalist is thinking from a subjective perspective. But now when we consider behavior from an objective perspective, this is what an externalist would do, a scientific perspective. That is, you could be looking at the brain, and you're not asking what the subject is experiencing, you're just looking at the physiology of the brain. And so, in other words, there are two ways to explain behaviors in people. One way to explain it is from an internalist perspective, and the other way to explain it is from an externalist perspective. So a compatibilist will make sure that you hold both of these realities in tension, but they're not in contradiction of one another. It's just two different ways of explaining the same behavior. Well, there are several critiques of compatibilism. Probably the most notable one is simply the suggestion that compatibilism is really just a wistful sort of determinism. William James, for example, argued that compatibilists are simply inconsistent determinists. So really, compatibilism just falls into determinism at the end of the day, but just pretends like it's not determinism. So here's what James means by this. So if you think of your brains externally as being determined by the chemical processes, that is determinism. But on the other hand, you experience some form of freedom. The compatibilist says both of these are consistent with one another. But of course, if your brain is causing you to experience freedom, then in reality, that freedom that you experience is actually a delusion. So it's of course true that we experience some sort of free will, but if what's true in reality is that our brain is causing us to experience that, then that experience itself is a delusion. Hence why James says that compatibilists are really just inconsistent determinists. It's simply a way of deluding yourself. Well, the compatibilist does have a response to this. And the response is simply that we need to make distinctions. This is something that you have to do whether you're a libertarian or whether you're a determinist. And in fact, the libertarian critiques of determinism, a compatibilist would agree with those critiques. And the determinist critiques of libertarian free will, a compatibilist would also agree with those critiques. But we still need to make distinctions when we're talking about human behavior. So, when it comes to judging the morality of human actions, the compatibilist argues that we need to look at it from a perspective of internal or experiential free will. Because if we don't do that, then the problem is that there is no morality to human actions, and the whole field of ethics just completely goes away. There's no reason to judge one action as more moral than another action. And so we need to hold on to free will. On the other hand, when it comes to the causal mechanisms of, say, neurobiology, we need to look at it from the perspective of external or scientific determinism. Because if we don't look at it from that perspective, then we'll have a hard time understanding the workings of the brain from a scientific perspective. And so the compatibilist simply argues that we need both of these, and even if there is a tension between them, we need to hold both, because if we fall into determinism, then we don't have any reasons for judging moral responsibility or moral behaviors. But yet if we fall into the free will camp, and we separate, say, the brain from the mind, then it makes scientific discoveries a lot more difficult. And so, again, this was a short lecture, but that's all we have for Chapter 22. Again, make sure that you read the chapter thoroughly.